What is governance and why does it even matter in cryptocurrency? We hear this concept talked about a lot, don't we? Governance. People talk about governance failures in cryptocurrency. People talk about certain coins being a governance coin or having on-chain governance or governance tokens or whatever. But what really is governance and why do you actually need it? Well, basically, governance is the ability to decide when you have a conflict. When a disagreement needs consensus, that's where governance comes in. Say you have a major upgrade you want to do to your chain to make this cryptocurrency work in a certain way. But then a bunch of people don't want that to happen. And there's disagreement, but there's only one way forward. It can either be one or the other. Everyone can get their way here or that way. You can't just say, well, we'll just kind of do both and just go with it. It doesn't work. At that point, you kind of need consensus. You need to come together, and the people who disagree need to all agree eventually. And the inability to all agree causes a governance problem. Now, it's important to know that governance only affects decentralized systems, right? Because if you have a centralized system, sure, you can see what people want to happen. You can poll your users, poll your whatever else. But if you're the decision maker, you just do everything. You just say, well, we have decided that we will do this. And then you just don't have a governance problem. You could have other problems, though, if you make a wrong decision that most of your users think is stupid, and then you lose out on that, of course, but that's not a governance problem. So I'm here to tell you why you need explicit governance in cryptocurrency. Now, some people will say, especially with Bitcoin and its forks, that Nakamoto Consensus is enough. That's already governance. That's all you need. Now, first, before we really talk about that in detail, let's get what Nakamoto Consensus is. It's basically the key of proof of work mining. So in order to run a network, participate in it, collect fees from processing transactions, and secure the network, in Nakamoto Consensus coins, what you need to do is you run mining software, whether it's on your phone or your laptop or whatever, just run the algorithm, but realistically probably specialized mining hardware sucking up a lot of electricity. That's what you use. And the more hash rate behind it, the more money you get relative to the pie. And then the bigger importance you have, I guess, in the network. So basically, if a certain version of the code base is run by miners, by enough miners, that's just the way the network goes. And if basically someone else decides to, I'm going to run a different version, I'm going to change it, then they basically get out of consensus with the rest of the network. The most of the hash rate is what decides, and then they basically get, forked off, and then they don't matter anymore. Or then they have to come in consensus with the network to stay on it and just keep things moving forward. And basically the idea of that is, let's just say the main code base gets taken over, the main development team gets taken over by some rogue entities, and then they start doing some sketchy things. Well, how do you do that? Should it just be you take over the developers and then all of a sudden your project isn't decentralized anymore, it gets ruined? Well, no. Basically, you can run an older or alternative version of the code base, and then if enough people, enough hash rate, enough computing power goes behind that, that just becomes the main chain that goes. And then the other one, of course, just dies off. There's not enough support on. In some cases, though, there's enough support behind multiple versions that you end up with a chain split. Most people just call it hard fork, but hard forks don't always turn into completely different competing chains. But basically, you have a chain split, so now, say there's a 60-40, and then the 60% side wins out, but the 40% side is still there, then it splits over time. And then there's two chains that basically now it's like one version and another version, and they're completely separate, but they kind of split from the main thing. And then those things can persist as separate projects at that point. And that's kind of how you solve disagreements that go beyond just, okay, well, these guys clearly won because they were the supermajority. I'm glossing over a lot of details here, so don't come at me with your nerd rage or whatever. Just trying to explain for the newbies exactly kind of generally how it works. Now, why isn't Nakamoto Consensus enough for governance? Well, let's just take to history really quickly. I mean, how many Bitcoins are there? Well, mainly there's Bitcoin, there's Bitcoin Cash, then there's Bitcoin SV, there's Bitcoin ABC or eCash, or whatever they're calling themselves these days. There's Bitcoin Gold, there's a whole bunch of different ones. With a few exceptions, basically every other Bitcoin that's out there doing a lot of the same things, but a lot less recognition, still competing for the same brand, and still having the exact same owners, pretty much, of all the coins. Every single one of those things happened at a chain split because there was a decision to make, and that's how the decision was made. In fact, it wasn't. It was a split. Every time a decision needed to be arrived on by the whole network, boom, split, 2 coins now. Bitcoin Cash split off from Bitcoin over the disagreement on whether to pursue on-chain or off-chain scaling. Bitcoin SV split from Bitcoin Cash over a disagreement on other protocol changes, including short-term block size increases. Bitcoin ABC split from Bitcoin Cash over disagreements on protocol-level development team funding. And this may not even be the end of the line for disagreements and splits, as another may happen the next time a problem arises. So the first problem with this is it just solves fringe, smaller issues, or bigger ones than that just end up being a split. And that's not exactly very efficient, right? So first off, of course, if you have smaller issues, which, a smaller issue is not really that much of an issue, and you just say, okay, well, we have a disagreement. Oh wait, but one side is like 90% plus of the hash rate. Like, okay, clearly who won, right? There's nothing really to decide at that point. But for more contentious issues where there's a more even split in support between those, then it just splits into 2 coins. And it's like, okay, well, is that really the best way of doing things? Like, I want my way more than those guys, but I'd much rather stick with the chain that wins, even if I don't get my way, than just create a completely new project from scratch. And the problem is when you have something contentious enough where one side isn't clearly overwhelmingly winning, that's just how it goes. It splits. And you can't just say like, all right, well, we all kind of came together, we all fought, but then one side won, and then that's the way the project goes forward. And if you really don't like it, you can, of course, start your own project from scratch, but it's not like an automatic split that just comes from every single time you couldn't come to an agreement. The second problem is it does an awful job of actually polling the network. So first off, just the way hash rate works. You have a whole bunch of miners, and you're going to mine on a chain, and it's profitable. At some point, if the price goes down enough or the competition goes up, you might turn off some of your miners because you don't want to be mining with everything when you're spending more on electricity than on the actual coins that you get from it. So the amount of hash rate that's being put forward at any one time is not necessarily representative of the total hash rate that's out there. So if you have a ton of hash rate, you might not be using it all at once. So then you'd have to, again, go mine at a loss with a whole bunch of extra hash rate if you wanted to make your voice heard. So the actual polling doesn't really occur in real time. And this is even more apparent with all the different coins that use the same hashing algorithms. So say I'm a Bitcoin miner and I'm putting all my hash rate behind Bitcoin, and it's not necessarily profitable at the top. So I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to take this band of, this little top bit off. I'm going to start mining Bitcoin Cash with it. So then it's still profitable on Bitcoin, and it's still profitable on Bitcoin Cash. And then maybe I throw some to Bitcoin SV or whatever else. Even if I'm a loyalist Bitcoin miner, I'm still mining these other ones for profitability. And so it's not really very accurate in pulling that. And of course, mining pools are representative of a whole lot of different miners, all pooling their resources together to basically mine more efficiently. And the pool might think a certain way. They might decide to signal a certain thing. But that doesn't necessarily mean all the people mining for it believe the same. They could be very conflicted on it. They could just keep mining because this is the pool they trust and they just want to keep doing it. They could not even be paying attention and just actually be supporting something they don't really even know about. And there's a whole lot of ways where basically you don't for sure know that you're getting an accurate representation of people who use this stuff. And third, you're only going with a certain segment of the network and leaving a whole lot of others out. You're going with miners who just run this expensive equipment to process transactions and get money. And that's basically it. And of course, they're a very key part of the network. They run a lot of things, but there's a lot of people that aren't represented in that. First off, whoever runs non-mining nodes or wallet providers, infrastructure, they're not represented at all. Developers are not represented at all, even though, mostly the code base might come from them, the actual code that people are voting on. So there is kind of that. Everyday users, like if I'm using this stuff all the time, I'm not represented in the slightest. Holders, people who put their life savings into this stuff, people who bought from miners in order to help them cover their own expenses, they have no representation at all. People that build expensive companies that are very crucial to providing the value behind these networks, they aren't represented at all unless they have miners. But those who choose not to do that, because not everyone can be mining, they have no voice at all. And so you might decide to make a decision, a governance decision based on mining hash rate. But then if you do that, you might basically be correct in going with whatever the miners want, but then that could really exclude a whole lot of people who actually gave the project value to begin with. And those people, then end up on the minority fork, and hey, wait, we made the wrong decision because most of the network is behind the hash rate minority in this case. So it becomes very messy. It's just not a very efficient system at all. The New York Agreement was a consensus among almost all of the major economic players in the Bitcoin ecosystem, all of whom favored block size increase to solve scaling wars, at least as part of a compromise which included SegWit. Yet they ended up losing, despite probably representing most of the actual investment in the network. The UASF movement opposed the agreement, and even though this group claimed to represent regular users, 90% or more of miners signaled support for the New York Agreement. Both groups are left out under Nakamoto Consensus, which only looks at the mining hash rate. There's another kind of a way that I've seen people use Nakamoto Consensus, which I call the centralized cop-out, because basically you have a single development team / company / whatever founding the coin, creating everything, basically calling all the shots, but it's still technically decentralized. And you say, well, anyone can mine on it, anyone can use it. It's completely decentralized, even though the centralized company runs everything. And I mean, that's kind of a cop-out for a couple of reasons. It doesn't really work as advertised because, first off, if a centralized company kind of calls all the shots, who is going to decide against them and say, okay, we're going to build our own equal, well-funded, whatever company from scratch and just we're going to be the new developers, and we're going to somehow get all the infrastructure that they control, that company controls, and somehow try to replicate it enough in order to just have a say in, okay, you should use our version of the code base. It's just not going to happen. So practically, in most cases, it just is a centralized project. And at that point, like, well, why do you want a decentralized project? Well, technically it is. Technically it's open source. Technically this. But practically speaking, it's a centralized project that the developers can be co-opted, or they can be basically pressured into adding some like KYC requirements or adding the ability to censor certain transactions or whatever else. And they just do it. And then what, is everyone going to just not mine that chain? No, of course. I mean, this is the only one that has value. There is no alternative development team. That's it. And so if you don't go with them, then basically you just tank the value of the project with no real good alternative. This is kind of the path that Zcash and Bitcoin SV sort of went to. Now, Zcash was a little bit more explicit in that the Electric Coin Company created the thing, and they actually had this founder's reward where a percentage of this decentralized network's money every month came to this centralized company. They just got it all. You couldn't even say, well, I'm an alternative development team. Nope. The protocol itself is pointing that this company owns it, even though it's structurally decentralized. Now, recently they did some changes where they reallocated some of that block reward to just a different foundation that they say they're not involved with or whatever, but it's basically been a centralized top-down model on a decentralized network from the beginning, and they might be moving away from that. Bitcoin SV is supposedly decentralized, and the way they say that is, well, the protocol is set in stone, it's not changing, no more hard forks, whatever, so therefore it can't be centralized because there's nothing to own. There's no decisions to be made. We're making no decision. Well, someone still made some decisions to enable those old opcodes, and there have been a couple different hard forks to increase the block size. Someone rolled that code, someone put it out there, someone all implemented it, right? Someone can always create an alternative somewhere down the line. Now, there's also a risk though. If you build a centralized development team, etc., on top of decentralized infrastructure, it can backfire on you. Like, for example, let's just say the case of Ethereum and Ethereum Classic. There was this big DAO hack where a smart contract was exploited. A whole bunch of people lost money, and Ethereum decided to roll back those transactions. Essentially, a group of people decided, no, we're going to just censor that. We're going to just use a top-down control to change the way things went. And some people weren't happy with that and decided to split and keep the original coins the way they went, and that's what Ethereum Classic is. So you have these cases where even though it's a sort of top-down system, it still has that risk of being plain old regular Nakamoto Consensus. So when you're using the centralized comp-out, either you end up having a centralized project, or you end up having the same problems that the centralized part was trying to avoid. So it doesn't really work either way. All right, so that's it for this video. I just wanted to cover the basics of what governance is and talk about how it works or doesn't with Nakamoto Consensus. Stay tuned because I will be doing a video at some point in the future that talks about more intentional forms of governance out there. And so stay tuned for that. I have made a few videos already on the governance struggles and interviewed a few different people on this whole Nakamoto Consensus thing. Make sure to check those out if you're interested. If you're interested in the governance subject, check out the interviews I did with Roger Ver and Amari Sachet on the Bitcoin ABC split. and the summary with my conclusions. Okay, that's really it this time. See you guys next time.